You are watching the present tense. My name is Irina Fedorov. Hello, and our guest today is the journalist and publicist Vitaly Portnikov, with whom we will discuss the latest news. Vitaly, hello. Over the past 3 weeks, unknown drones have violated the airspace of many European countries, more than once, and not twice. While well-known Russian drones flew into Poland, Russian fighters flew into Estonia. How do you assess everything that has been happening in the last days and week?
I regard this as a natural spread of the Russian-Ukrainian war on the territory of other countries. Well, actually, there is nothing new and nothing unexpected in this. When in the 30s Germany refused to demilitarize the Rhineland, then made an Anschluss of Austria, and then agreed to transfer the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia to the Reich, too. Many did not really understand what would happen next. Such conflicts are always maximized because the aggressor, if he does not meet the proper response, either increases his appetites or tests the red lines of the countries with which he is in conflict directly or indirectly.
But you said in another interview that the war could spread to Europe as early as February 2026 year. And why February? Where did you get such an assessment from?
I'm absolutely not talking about any February, I'm talking about 4 years. I said that 4 years is the time when the possibility of conflict spreading is maximized. We still see it now. If I were in our place, I would forget about some February 2026 year. This is just a symbolic figure of 4 years of the Russian-Ukrainian war, after which the conflict may increase. And that's all. It may happen earlier, it may happen later, it may happen in 2025 year, or it may happen in 2028. I wouldn't get hung up on numbers and dates at all.
And do you think Russia has the resources now to open another front and start another war?
And why do we need resources in order to open another front? You yourself are talking about drones and fighter jets. And the war can have a hybrid character, as Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk quite logically stated. At the summit of the European political community, Europe is already at war, just in a different type of war. There was a technological breakthrough in the war. War can now take place with the help of unmanned aerial vehicles or with the help of cyber diversion. I think in a year and a half, piece-by-piece intelligence will be fully integrated into military tasks. Therefore, if I were you, I would not prepare for the wars of the past and assume that Russian tanks must necessarily enter the territory of NATO countries there, or, by the way, the same planes should bomb European cities. No. There may be a number of other events that will be of a military nature, but will not resemble the wars of the past.
And according to the reaction of European politicians, do you think they realize this? Vucic says that Europe is preparing for war. What kind of war is Europe preparing for? Are they aware that the risks have changed?
Well, I don't think you need to pay attention to what Vucic says at all, to be honest. Because, in his opinion, to resist some aggressive actions of Russia is preparing for war. As a pro-Russian politician, he can express such thoughts, but in my opinion, just not to resist the aggressive actions of Russia means to prepare for war. In this sense, Vucic obviously does not mean what I mean.
I would like to recall another European politician, Angela Merkel, in an interview with a Hungarian media partisan, said that Poland and the Baltic states did not support the initiative of direct negotiations with Russia in the 21st year. If you don't mind, let's listen to an excerpt.
I wanted a new format in which we could talk to Putin on behalf of the European Union. Some did not support it. First of all, these are the Baltic countries. Poland was also against it, fearing that we would not have a common policy towards Russia.
And now the Russian state media is already presenting it in such a way that Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania disrupted negotiations with Russia, and indirectly thus led to Russia invading Ukraine in the 22nd year. What do you think of this statement, Merkel?
As a misunderstanding of the true causes of the war. What Putin calls the root causes.
And how do you understand the root causes of the conflict?
I think that no one in Russia hides the root causes of the conflict. This is the need to restore Moscow's influence in the post-Soviet space. In the case of Ukraine and Belarus, this is the integration of the territories of these countries into Russia in the future. Actually, part of the territory of Ukraine has already been annexed. This is Crimea. This is Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, Zaporozhye region. As you can see, no one is even trying to create any parallel governments there to talk about the existence of good and bad Ukraine. Ukraine anti-Russia, Ukraine pro-Russia, and simply those Ukrainian regions that are occupied by the Russian army become Russia. The root causes of the war are in the very fact of the declaration of independence of the former Soviet republics. and the fact that Moscow decided that they would not be able to achieve the integration of these republics into the Russian state by political and economic methods. Therefore, this is the root cause of this war. This is August 1991. Already at this time, the future history of this war was written. We just came to a completely, if you will, inevitable result.
Yeah, and Dmitry Kuleba, the ex-minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, says that at this stage, where we are now in this war, the goal of Kiev and its partners is to change Putin's maximalist goal of conquering the whole of Ukraine to a more real one, conditionally, so that he agrees to the territories that he has already captured. Do you think there are any levers of pressure on Putin to change his goals? And if so, how can this be done?
If Russia does not have the financial, economic, and demographic potential, it will have to at least agree to a ceasefire in the territory where Russian-Ukrainian troops are currently located. If Russia has this potential, the war will continue in the 20s and 30s of this century.
Is there such a prospect that in the near future, Russia will run out of either money or people?
It depends on what happens next. It will depend on how much the partners will be able to destroy Russia's economic potential. First of all, we are talking not only about sanctions, but also about the destruction of the infrastructure of the Russian state. Economic, energy, military. And it will be about how much Vladimir Putin is ready to turn the army of mercenaries that he has created over the past 3.5 years into an army of demobilized citizens, who will not receive money for the war, but simply, let's say, will be mobilized, because that will be the decision of the head of state. Will Putin go for this type of mobilization?
And here, by the way, how can Russians react to a big war if it becomes even bigger, and general mobilization in the country in general?
I think that this mobilization will not cause much excitement, and then everything will depend on the stability of the power apparatus. It is difficult to say how this will all happen, because we do not know the level of readiness of Russian society, let's say, to fight for their own lives. If there is such a general mobilization, we have seen that people are ready to flee. But we have also seen that people are not ready to resist en masse. Therefore, I have no forecast on this score.
And Russian propaganda cannot help Putin inspire people to go big in this.
I don't believe in propaganda, I believe that people have beliefs, and if the government line corresponds to these beliefs, they perceive this government line. If they do not conform to these beliefs, they either struggle with this government line, or are simply forced to obey it, because the power apparatus of suppression is effective. Nothing else happens at all.
But then I would like to recall the American historian Timothy Snyder, and he says that Western elites are conditional Western elites. They are subject to Russian propaganda, that they still believe that Russia is a big, strong state that can respond with a nuclear strike, and does not capture the Donetsk region, conditionally not because it cannot, but because some other goals are pursued as it seems to you. Does such a thought have a right to exist? Or is it not Russian propaganda but some other reasons why Europe?
This is not Russian propaganda, this is fear of Russia.
And where does it come from?
The fear of Russia can be both rational and rational in nature, and associated with historical complexes, as in Central Europe. You remember how many times Russian troops came to me in Hungary and trampled on Hungarian freedom, both in the 19th and in the 20th century. What happened in the Czech Republic and Slovakia? What happened in other countries? But if we recall the Second World War, the Soviet troops came to Berlin, in general to Europe as such. And in the 19th century, they reached Paris. Therefore, the question here is not how rational this fear is, but that it exists. And besides, Western elites may have a feeling that the current Russian leadership does not see red lines at all, that yes, a nuclear strike can be inflicted, and Moscow is successfully speculating with this fear. In general, I believe that the transformation of nuclear weapons from a deterrent weapon into a blackmail weapon is a fairly effective tool for influencing Western elites, both American and European.
And you mentioned red lines. Do you think there are any red lines for the current Russian government that they are not ready to cross?
No.
Up to a tactical or some kind of strategic nuclear strike on Ukraine.
I am not sure that this tactical nuclear strike can necessarily be inflicted on Ukraine.
And where, for example?
It can also be inflicted on any military object on the territory of NATO if the Russian leadership believes that there is no other method to force the West to accept Russian conditions. But so far, I don't see any reason that this can happen. You just asked me if they have any red lines. Putin has no red lines. This does not mean that he will take any steps. It's just that this is not due to the fact that he has or does not have a red line, but to how he assesses the expediency of a particular step in terms of his role in world politics.
Putin said twice a day, if I'm not mistaken, that the next step of escalation would be the transfer of American long-range Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. Do you think there would be some potentially fundamentally new response if Ukraine really received these missiles?
I don't think there was a fundamentally new response for the reason that the escalation will continue, regardless of which missiles Ukraine receives.
And what options are now in front of the Kremlin? Except for this kind of intimidation, we can say Europe is unidentified.
It is you who need to turn not to me, but to the general staff in the FSB. I think they are considering such options and discussing them and are now deciding what to do next.
Well, in fairness, I should also note that the Kremlin denies that it was Russian drones that flew into the territories of NATO countries, although Putin, at a meeting of the Valdai Club in Sochi, as if jokingly replied that we would not do it anymore. When asked about drones in Denmark,
well, you know, it's an eternal story with the fact that we're not there, right? So it was in the Crimea, so it was everywhere, so it was in the Donbass, when it was not the Russian troops who rebelled minors. This was once the case in Transnistria. Russia always commits such escalatory steps, claims that it is not responsible for them. This is the ghost of Glabitz, which haunts the Russian leadership.
And why is Russia doing this? More than 10 years have passed. If no one believes in it anymore, what is the effectiveness of such a strategy?
Russia creates an opportunity not to respond to its steps to those who do not want to respond. And this is happening. In the West, there is no need to discuss whether it is necessary to shoot down these drones. Are they threatening, not threatening? Is it necessary to go to a confrontation with Russia if she herself does not want a confrontation to say that it is not her? Russia creates options for the absence of reality. Reactions, sorry.
And in this way, it also forms reality. One of the possible levers of pressure on Russia is being actively discussed now is the transfer to Ukraine of frozen Russian assets that are located in Europe. How effective do you think this solution can be, and what risks does it have?
So far, I see no reason to believe that European countries are ready to transfer these assets, because many European leaders are confident that the risks from the point of view of the further functioning of the European financial system in this case are quite large.
I would also like to ask about the Russian reality. Yulia Navalnaya recently wrote a column for The Economist magazine where she said, well, you can say that she even reproached Europe a little bit, that they do not have a strategy for Russia. But do you think the West should have a strategy for Russia? And what should it be, if so?
I think there should be a strategy of political, economic, military, and informational resistance to Russia. It certainly should be, but again, to do this, we need to understand the entire long-term nature of the conflict in which we are. First of all, the European elites need to tell you how long all this will last, how it threatens Europe itself, to what extent European countries are ready to counteract, and what measures they should take. What should they do? To turn a drone into a moat with crocodiles, to create new information resources aimed at Russia, as once during the Cold War. Only effective. Increase military budgets and understand how the war is changing and react to it too. All this requires, so to speak, a fairly serious thought-out policy. But it seems to me that Miss Navalny's column was talking about completely different things because she lives in her own world. That has nothing to do with either the West or Russia, but has to do with the attempts of part of the Russian opposition to perceive part of its citizens as a potential electorate.
How much time do you think Europe has to rethink and form this new policy, which Yulia Navalnaya would like to see?
There is no time for a long time.
Yeah, and do Russians both at home and abroad understand why this war is going on at all?
Of course. Russians are well aware that we are talking about restoring what they consider to be the state. The vast majority of Russians perceive Russia as an empire and perceive the former Soviet republics as lost territories. Therefore, there is no doubt that in this war, Vladimir Putin speaks with the voice of the Russian people. As for Russians abroad, but they are also different people, just like people in Russia. I admit that some part of the citizens of the Russian Federation who live abroad are able to perceive Russia not as an empire, but as a future proto-national state there. Although the modern Russian Federation is not such a state, it is an instrument, so to speak, of suppression by ethnic Russians, of other peoples of the Russian Federation. So it looks like a state structure today. But I'm not sure that people who understand the whole essence of what is happening, let's say, the colonial essence, of not even the Russian state, but the Russian people in this state, that they are in the majority in their own country.
You have repeatedly said that the Russian army strikes at civilian objects, elderly homes, in order to simply intimidate Ukrainians and break their spirit, that this is such a tactic of intimidation. Do you think this tactic works in the fourth year of the war?
No, it doesn't work. Ukrainians are not so easily intimidated. But that's not even the point. The fact is that I have never seen any army achieve any success in intimidation without a direct military presence in the occupied territory.
That is, conditionally, until the Dnieper is shelled with artillery, until the Russian army approaches so close. The residents will not.
Where it should come close. It should be located in the cities themselves. The fact that she will fire something from artillery will also change a little. Sarajevo was shelled from artillery from the nearby mountains. But this did not give rise to the desire of the residents of this city, so to speak, to capitulate to the Bosnian Serbs and their military formations. It is necessary to be in the city itself, then you can intimidate someone. Remember how the Russian occupiers intimidated the population of Kherson simply by purges from deportation, arrests. That's how it works. And then not always. And if you shoot, it doesn't work.
At the same time, there is still talk of war fatigue, and even if we're not talking about
wars, it is a natural thing that in a state of war fatigue, one can live as long as the war will continue, if there is no alternative.
And how does this affect Ukrainian society?
But people are just getting tired of the war, which is quite natural right now. When there may be some more intense strikes on the territory of the Russian Federation, we will see blackouts there, as in Belgorod, in other cities. We will see some kind of destruction of military enterprises, the oil and energy complex. And perhaps the Russians will also be tired of the war. But fatigue is not a factor for the end of the war. The factor of the end of the war is the understanding of the need for this end on certain conditions.
But if we try to give some concrete examples, and we don't talk clearly about I don't know sleepy nights and bags under the eyes, what exactly does war fatigue manifest itself in people?
It needs to be robbed by sociologists. I'm not a sociologist.
And according to your observations, you live in Ukraine as people.
I think it's all a very individual thing.
Then individually do you have some kind of internal change that you have felt in recent years?
I'm a journalist. A journalist should not get tired but record the process.
Then I realized the next question is also about Ukraine. In Kiev, the streets are covered with posters with the face of Andrei Beletsky. Rumors have appeared that Vitaly Portnikov has opened an election headquarters in Russia in London. I'm sorry, an interview with Sergei Tjipko recently appeared on Forbes. Do you think there are any developments in Ukraine, as if in the direction of elections?
In Kiev, there are no posters that cover the streets with portraits of Andrei Beletsky. At least, I don't see anything like that. Maybe it exists somewhere. Maybe it has something to do with the desire to attract people to his team. I don't see any streets with portraits of Andrei Beletsky. Sergei Tjipko's Forbes interview is a statement of a businessman who wants to remind about his contribution to the economy. About Valery Zaluzhny's headquarters, I don't know much, and I don't know if it really exists. There is no point in talking about elections until the war ends. I don't see any objective grounds for ending the war in the foreseeable future.
I have heard such an opinion of Ukrainian journalists that it seems that now politicians seem to be preparing for elections. And not that they are preparing, but they make such decisions as if they can pass you within 3 months or 6 months. Do you have such a feeling?
That politicians also live in their own reality, which has nothing to do with what is really happening. This also happens with politicians.
Then let's fast forward to the neighboring country of Belarus. It was possible to notice recently the so-called warming in relations between the United States and Belarus. Do you think this is how Trump is trying to distance Lukashenko from Putin? How do you understand this strategy?
Perhaps Trump had an idea to create a kind of window of communication with Russia that would not hold him responsible for some kind of normalization of Russian-American relations, but would create opportunities for such interaction. I think that Lukashenko does not play any role here, that it is rather a person who is in this window. The cashier is like that, relatively speaking. But I don't think it will be of particular interest to anyone now, given that there is no real dialogue between Washington and Moscow.
And here is Trump's latest statement, that he considers Putin's initiative about extending the nuclear weapons treaty to be a good one. As if
this that some consultations can take place on the track of nuclear disarmament. But again, they will necessarily run into the parties' misunderstanding of certain aspects of this kind of disarmament.
Yeah, and now a number of elections have been held in Europe. First, the parliamentary elections in Moldova. Then, the parliamentary elections in the Czech Republic, and Moldova managed to defend their European choice. Moldovans chose Andrej Babis in the elections in the Czech Republic. How do you assess the results of the elections in these countries?
Well, you said it yourself. The Republic of Moldova was able to defend the principles and approaches defended by the pro-European forces, which are defended by President Maja Sanda, and in the Czech Republic. The hands of the clock have again switched to the dial that the Czech Republic has already seen for many years, when Andrej Babis was Prime Minister of the country. It is clear that Babis will be more, let's say, Eurosceptic, more cautious in terms of support for Ukraine and support by Europe. The fight against the Russian danger by a politician than his predecessors. But this does not mean that the Czech Republic will somehow be able to ignore the challenges that the continent will face in the coming years.
But in some media, I have already seen that Babisha, Orban and Fitz are put as if in one row, that this will be such a pro-Russian belt in Europe. What do you think?
Well, you know yourself that Babis is a more complex figure of someone else's benefits. We remember his reaction to the bombings of weapons depots by Russian agents in the Czech Republic. These were not at all the words, statements and actions that Urban Lifitsi could have taken in this case, right?
And then I'll go back half a step to Moldova. How do you think they managed not to choose Dodon and the pro-Russian forces?
How did you manage not to choose? That's what you said with the voters.
But it was still some work that was done, because the pro-Russian grid was actively working. We have seen the investigation, for example.
I think that the work is being carried out precisely when the authorities do not allow themselves to be intimidated, and are fighting in a legal way with those who are trying to use democratic tools to impose on citizens the choice that citizens would not have made in any case if there were not all these nets, funding from other countries and so on and that sort of thing. In other words, by and large, Moldova simply demonstrated in these elections its readiness to act within the same legal framework of their procedures as other European countries. You understand that somewhere in Germany and France you will not be able to finance political forces underground. In countries like Germany, the careers of the most respected politicians, such as Helmut Kohl, ended when they found out that certain funds for political forces from German businessmen were not properly issued. And here the funding comes directly from Moscow, and we pretend that all this is the norm of political life. No, this is not the norm of political life, as well as the impact, so to speak, with the participation of certain propaganda or other resources.
And in the Kremlin, did you perceive such an outcome of the elections in Moldova as your defeat?
I assure you that Putin shouted at Kirienko.
And the traditional question, to which I probably know your answer: when do you think the war will end?
We are not futurologists, but journalists. We should not tell people about some unsubstantiated facts, dates, and expectations.
Thank you very much. It was Vitaly Portnikov, a Ukrainian journalist and publicist. You have been watching the TV channel at the moment. My name is Irina Fedorov. Goodbye.